Hi everyone, it's Sandra, and this is my favorite worm bin I call Cinderella. I'm just going to pull off this burlap, and it looks like I've got a few sprouts here and there to deal with. All right, so today's worm science topic that I want to talk to you about is population density. If you remember the last time I said Cinderella was getting kind of chubby, a little bit bulky, I thought. And so I think it's time to move her towards a harvest. She has what I think is a pretty robust worm population in here. So I wanted to talk to you about worm density. And so I researched it in advance of doing this. So typically, those of us in the worm composting community, we're advised to start with maybe 500 or 1,000 worms in a typical worm bin. And so the research that I looked at today, and I'm going to put the link to it in the description, it examined how fast various densities of worm populations go through the material, how that affects the growth of the worms themselves, and how it affects the quality of the resulting vermicompost. It's always hard to generalize research to real-world conditions, but I thought maybe there'll be some tidbits in here that these findings will help me and maybe some of you make a decision of when is the vermicompost built up too much and what are some of the hints of when is it a good time to harvest. I make the decision to harvest because I want to keep my worms working and productive as much as possible. I want them to produce castings for me, and I think they do that best when they're removed from mostly finished vermicompost like this, and they're given new material to start again. And remember, though, I never totally deplete a worm bin. I always leave some of the old material in to inoculate any new material I bring in. But I also think we have to pull material out when we are trying to build up our worm population. So the worms will bump into each other more often and lead to more breeding. That was my whole way of thinking when I was in my first year of worm farming. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through what the worm research said about worm density, and maybe that will help us decide when is the best time to harvest a bin. Researchers use the term stocking density to refer to how many worms you can have in a given volume of bedding. I was surprised they don't look at surface area, which is what you often hear other worm farmers talk about when we talk about how many worms you can have in a bin. Certainly with Gilligan, my turtle worm farm that has such a great surface area to depth ratio, that's always why I thought, boy, he could have a lot of worms in here. But the researchers use volume of bedding, so that's what I'm going to report on today. The researchers in this study looked at 6 different stocking densities of Eisenia fetida, those are the red wiggler worms, and then they looked at the growth potential of those worms as well as the resulting vermicompost quality. You can find the link to this research in the description of the video. So how do we visualize the worm densities that are used by these researchers in our worm bins? It's going to be a bit tricky, but I'll try. So the researchers measured out 8 kilograms of shredded, dried green waste. That is 17.6 pounds of green waste. Now you hear the word green and you think about food scraps, but that's not what the researchers meant. They defined green waste as plant material that occurs naturally or during the maintenance in like urban green spaces, things like tree pruning and shrubs, as well as lawn mowings, dead branches, leaf litter, and fallen flowers. So they took that 8 kilogram or 17.6 pounds of green waste and they put it in a tote that measures 0.6 by 0.45 by 0.35 meters. So that's about 23 by 17 by 12 inches, or about the same size as Cinderella. So the researchers said they used 8 kilograms of dried pulverized bedding that had been shredded to less than 5 millimeters or less than 1/20th of an inch. Now, I don't have a shredder that I can use for outdoor material, but I do have a bag of dried pulverized herbs that I bought. It's unopened. It's 1 pound. So in the researchers' terms, I would need 17.6 of these to fill the bin. And then they base their worm density calculations on 1 kilogram of bedding at a time. So that's basically just over 2 of these bags at a time. So when I'm talking about treatment 1, treatment 2, treatment 3, that's the worm density calculation is based on 8 kilograms total, and about 2.2 of these bags equals 1 kilogram. But remember, they're going to compress down a lot because they're taking them to 70% moisture. I hope that helps. The researchers had 6 different conditions. They pre-moistened it, like I said, and they pre-composted it for 15 days. Then in 5 of the conditions, they added a certain number of worms. And in the 6th condition, they left it alone. That was their control. That basically measures the normal degradation of organic material without the introduction of worms. The 5 experimental conditions were known as T1 through T5, and they corresponded to 10 worms per kilogram all the way up to 50 worms per kilogram in T5. That would mean that the T1 conditions had 80 worms in the bin total. T2 would have 160 worms. T3 would have 240 worms. T4 would have 320 worms at the beginning. And T5 would have 400 worms to start. Because this green waste is far more complex than the food scraps produced by restaurants or the coffee grounds by the coffee industry, it takes a much longer time to break down naturally, and there's so much of it as towns go around just doing their normal maintenance of their landscaping. And so you can see how this is a brewing problem of how to address this growing amount, this growing volume of green waste. The researchers note that other methods, such as the production of biofuels, isn't really appropriate here because this is a very complex structure, this material, and there's too much cellulose and lignin in it to make biofuels an effective use for this waste. So towns are left with, what do they do? Do they decompose them naturally in landfills, which of course could contaminate groundwater, produces methane gases, and it takes a long time? Or do they incinerate them, burn them? And that's also damaging to the air quality. So that's where the worms come in. So you can see why these researchers were interested in how many worms is the optimum density to take care of this complex type of material. They want to maximize the speed of processing and the quality of the resulting vermicompost. As I said, the researchers added water every few days to keep the bins at approximately 70% moisture. However, their data showed that when the earthworm stocking density was too low, that's like the T1 condition, there were fewer burrows in the vermicomposting. That allows for less space for air and moisture to pass through. Remember, I've been talking about gas exchange in a worm bin. And that allows moisture to stagnate in that low density condition and affects aeration. In contrast, there were more continuous and wider diameter pores or burrows in the vermicompost when they had a lot of worms in there and the high stocking densities like T5. So aeration in the substrate was excessive and water dissipated more quickly, resulting in some reduction in the moisture holding capacity of the bedding. The study found that the best moisture retention and aeration was found in the T3 condition with 30 worms per kilogram. A decrease in organic matter is an indication of waste decomposition and mineralization, and that's the maturity of vermicomposting. So conversion of bedding into a finished product requires the action of the worms to increasingly break down material as it passes through their gut. They deposit castings that will still contain some unprocessed material, but the worms have sliced and diced the bedding as it passes through their gut as a mushy form, so that microorganisms have a greater surface area to work on to finish the material. It's a mutual relationship between the two organisms. If you have too few worms, they don't break down the bedding into smaller amounts, so the actions of the microorganisms is limited and slowed. If you have too many worms, the worms will grab any available food. Remember, not all the bedding will be available to the worms all at once. So this means competition, means there's very little available food hanging around. There are fewer castings are produced. And so with fewer castings produced, even though the worm population is larger, there will be less of that chopped up bedding for the microorganisms to get to work. So if a higher number of worms don't have any food to process, it will slow the maturation of the material. Again, this research showed a middle-of-the-road worm density will give the best results. In terms of worm growth, I'll put up a chart that shows how these adult worms grew very rapidly during the first 30 days. Then they started to drop off in size as the study neared its 60-day completion. The group with the poorest growth was the one with the lowest density of worms, that's T1 as you see, and the next poorest growth was in the T5 condition. That's the highest density of worms. The group that grew the fastest and maintained the highest average mass per worm was the group, again, with the medium density, T3. The researchers did not feed these worms any additional material other than to maintain the moisture in the bin. So basically the worms were competing for resources and space throughout the experiment. Here are 3 more charts that show nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium all follow the same pattern, with highest levels found in the bin conditions that contained the moderate number of worms, T3. The researchers go into scientific explanations for this, which for brevity in this video, I refer you to the study itself if you're interested. All of the treatment conditions had much richer microbial environments, including both bacteria and fungi, than the control condition, which was just naturally decaying green materials, that green waste materials. The gut of a worm greatly accelerates and amplifies microbial growth, which is enhanced when the amount of nutrients available matches the worm population. In this case, the researchers found the most suitable worm population to achieve this microbial growth was, again, the T3 condition. A final really interesting tidbit from this study was that the researchers used something called the seed germination index to assess the maturation or completion of the vermicompost. So when you see seeds germinating in your bin, that indicates that there's the presence of over 80% finished vermicompost. So you saw me pulling those sprouts at the beginning, which shows that over 80% of this bin has completed or near completed vermicompost. I find that fascinating. Okay, everyone, thanks for watching. Bye for now.